it is for me an honor and a pleasure to be here with you. And I wanted to say something in Irish, which I understand means hello, and you'll tell me if I pronounce it right. Di Yev? I want to first of all congratulate the organizers of this conference, Sharon, and all the wonderful people who have really put in so much work and so much passion and so much love in organizing this wonderful conference. And I also want to thank them for inviting me. It really was, I was here listening to the other speakers and to the music. It really was worth crossing an ocean and a continent to be with you here today. Now, I've been asked to tell you about findings from my research, identifying the core components of a safer, more equitable and caring world. One, yes, where women and children are finally safe, which, well, that's a goal that's so very, very close to my heart. And in so doing, to also place violence against women and children in its larger social and historical context. And most importantly, to explore with you how to bring about fundamental change, not only in the prevailing worldview, but in our lives and our world. So that's a lot that I'm going to be talking with you about. But like so many of the speakers that have been here before me, I too would like to share a little about my own story with you first, because my work and the passion for it, and I have a great deal of passion for it, is rooted also in my own very early life experiences as a child refugee from Nazi Europe along with my parents. And this really, we escaped by a hair's breadth. We're very, very lucky to be able to get out, but we were not able to get out until after Kristallnacht. And I don't know how many of you know why it's called Kristallnacht or that it even happened. But it was called Kristallnacht because of all the glass that was shattered in Jewish homes and in synagogues and in shops. And it was on that night, as a little girl, that a gang of Nazis, Austrian and German Nazis, broke into our home, and I watched in horror as they dragged my father away. So that night, I witnessed cruelty, violence, but I also saw something else that night, something that made an equally profound impression on me, what I call spiritual courage. And my mother displayed this spiritual courage, the courage to stand up against injustice out of love. She recognized one of the Nazis as an Austrian who had been an errand boy for the family business, and she got furious. And she demanded, "How dare you do this to this man who has been so kind to you? I want him back." Now, my mother could have been killed that night. Many Jewish people were killed on Kristallnacht. But by a miracle, she wasn't. By a miracle, she managed to get my father's release, because if she hadn't, of course, I wouldn't be here. Because like so many other families, we would have stayed waiting, hoping that he would be released from a concentration camp. Of course, he never would have been, and we would have instead been taken to one. Some money did pass hands that night. We were fortunate because my parents were able to buy not only my father's freedom, but an exit visa and an entry permit to Cuba, one of only 2 places in the world that gave entry permits to Jewish refugees from the Nazis at that time. And so we left Vienna at night, just carrying what we could carry with us. And I grew up in the industrial slums of Havana because, of course, the Nazis confiscated, that's an official term for armed robbery, of course. Confiscated everything my parents had. And so there I experienced dire poverty. And I also saw it around me, because in those days, the Batista days, the class differences in Cuba were horrendous, and the poverty was horrendous. These were traumatic experiences, because we lived there for 7 years. My parents finally did get back on their feet, but it was very interesting because I sort of experienced culture shock every day, because my parents, like so many European Jewish families, felt that my education, that was it. I was going to get a good education, and somehow they were going to scrimp and save and manage. So every day I took the streetcar from the slums of Havana to the suburbs and then back. So every day it was really culture shock for me. And these experiences, of course, yes, they were traumatic, but for one thing, living first in Vienna and then in Cuba and then moving to the United States, I learned a very important lesson about change, about the possibility of change, because it was very clear that what people considered givens, just the way things are, is not the same everywhere. But the main thing that those experiences led to were questions. Questions that I imagine many of you have asked at some time in your lives. Questions about why, when we humans have such an incredible capacity for caring, for consciousness. I mean, as evidenced by all the wonderful people here at this conference, why? Why has there been so much insensitivity, so much cruelty, so much violence? Is it, as we're often told, inevitable, just human nature? Or are there alternatives? And if so, what are these? And it was these questions that eventually led me to my research, my writing, my activism. But it wasn't until another pivotal experience that I want to tell you about. Because the title of my talk is Waking Up from the Domination Trance. And that was in the late 1960s, when suddenly I awoke as if from a long drugged sleep, along with thousands of other women all over the Western world. And I realized that as much as having been born Jewish almost cost me my life, having been born female had profoundly impacted everything, my life options, even how I saw myself. So that was the beginning of my waking up from the domination trance, because until then, that was just the way things are, We all took it for granted somehow. And thank goodness, that's no longer the case. And you here are such a wonderful example of what can happen when we no longer take injustice and violence for granted as just the way things are, when we have the spiritual courage. But it does waking up, doesn't it, from the domination trance. So I threw myself into the then just emerging women's liberation movement. I drew on my background, because I have a background in both as an attorney as well as a systems scientist. And we worked for laws to change the laws. But when the Equal Rights Amendment to the US Constitution was defeated, a simple amendment that would simply have said that neither the US government nor any state can discriminate on the basis of sex, it became very clear that what we need is what we are here talking about, a cultural transformation. But the question then was, well, a transformation from what to what, right? And it's really interesting, because the old paradigm fragments our consciousness. Our language, for example. We're all used to the social categories of right versus left, religious versus secular, Eastern versus Western, Northern versus Southern. But think about it for just a moment. Those categories are really, well, a friend of mine, a colleague, calls them weapons of mass distraction. Because none of them, first of all, look at the whole of a culture. They look at location, they look at economics, but they don't look at the whole picture. And what do they leave out of the picture, all of them? Yes, the cultural construction of our foundational human relations. I mean, think about it. We are beginning to understand something, and this is one of the key findings from my research, that is very, very important if we are going to change not only the prevailing worldview, but the world. And this is that, we're all used to the narratives, aren't we? That, if you take the studies of society, for example, hardly any of them look at the whole of humanity, both its female and male halves. But we don't notice that, do we? We're so used to it. Hardly any of them take into account how these foundational human relations, the relations that children first observe, first experience, childhood relations and gender relations, even though we know today from neuroscience that what children observe in their early years and experience in their early years actually impacts how our brains develop. That's right. And of course that translates, doesn't it, into how we think, how we feel, how we act. They ignore that. So it isn't just our categories, it's what's taught as important knowledge and truth, isn't it? So we don't get a complete picture. And one of the real problems, of course, which is why, again, the conventional social categories are useless if we're going to build that more equitable, caring, and safe future, is that if you really think about it, societies in every one of those conventional categories, rightist, leftist, religious, secular, Eastern, Western, Northern, Southern, etc., capitalist, socialist, have been violent, have been oppressive, have been inequitable, and yes, have despoiled our natural environment. So when I embarked on my study, my multidisciplinary cross-cultural study, to really animated by the questions of my childhood, I drew from a much larger database. As I said, unlike conventional studies, often aptly called the study of man, right? I drew from a database that takes into account the whole of humanity, both its female and male halves. Also, these studies really focus on what we might call the public sphere, politics, economics, religion, But they fail to take into account, as I said, the cultural construction of our foundational formative relations, the relations between the two basic forms of humanity, female and male, and between them and their daughters and sons. Well, the database that this study drew from actually looked at the whole of our lives, including not just politics and economics, but where we all live, in our family and other intimate relations. And as those of you familiar with books of mine like The Chalice and the Blade and Sacred Pleasure know, the study took into account the whole of our history, not like the siloed approach of most historical studies, and that whole of our history actually also includes the thousands of years of our prehistory. And of course, you know, if we only look at part of a picture, well, we can't see the whole picture, right? We can't see all of its parts, much less how they interconnect with one another. And this is really fundamental, because if we start looking at society from this, you know, using this larger database, we see that underneath all of these conventional categories are two basic configurations. And Sharon mentioned one of them, the domination system, which is what we're trying to leave behind. And the other is the partnership system. And I'm going to suggest to you that if we're going to make the foundational changes that we must make, it is really important that we understand the configurations of these two underlying possibilities for organizing human societies. And I'm going to say to you, of course, that no society is a pure domination or partnership system. It's always a matter of degree, of a partnership domination continuum or a partnership domination social scale. But if you look at some of the most oppressive and regressive modern societies, you're going to see something very interesting. For example, if you look at Nazi Germany, which is, of course, a Western secular society, right? Or if you look at Kim Jong-un's North Korea, which is an Eastern secular society. If you look at the Taliban of Afghanistan, which is an Eastern religious society, or if you look at the would-be theocratic regimes of Western religious fundamentalists, what you see writ large is the domination configuration. And I want to just very briefly go through that with you, because once you start thinking in this way, a lot of things that seem random and disconnected begin to fall into place, and we're empowered. We're empowered to take action in a different way. So despite all of these differences, you know, of these societies I just mentioned, they all really are close to the core domination configuration. First of all, they have hierarchies of domination, authoritarian rule in both the family and the state or tribe. And you know, it's so important that we really look at the family, as you are doing here, because families don't arise in isolation. They're part of a larger system. And yes, those relationships in families play an enormously important role in maintaining either a domination or a partnership system. The second part of the configuration is also something that you are here addressing. And these are societies that rank male over female. They have rigid gender stereotypes, and with this, and this is vital, we find the devaluation of anything that is considered soft or feminine. caring, caregiving, nonviolence. And, it's devalued in men. I mean, men who are soft and caring, they're sissies, right? Weak sisters. And of course, since these are societies in which male is ranked over female, only men rule. And so what happens then is that these so-called soft or feminine values that are vital for human survival, for human flourishing, for really nurturing our basic humanity of both women and men, they're not part of the guiding social and economic system of values. And that's something, so you start to connect the dots in a different way, and you also then see that there's a third component in these societies, which is the third component of the domination system, and these are all mutually supporting, as I said, and that is socially condoned and even idealized violence. Yes, from child and wife beating to pogroms to aggressive warfare. And if you think about it, this violence is necessary in order to maintain the system, either the threat of that violence or the violence itself. Because how else are you going to maintain these rigid rankings of man over woman, man over man, race over race, religion over religion? You see, it's built into the system. Now, by contrast, the core configuration of the partnership system, and we really, I think it's very important that we understand that core configuration so that we can be focused. And thank goodness you here are focused on some basics, I mean really basics. But the first, of course, the first component is that there is more democracy, more egalitarianism in both the family and the state or tribe. The second component is, well, what we're aiming for here, equal partnership, not sameness, but equal partnership between women and men. And with this, and this is very important, a high valuing of so-called soft or feminine traits, such as caring, caregiving, and nonviolence in both women and men, as well as in social and economic policy. And I'll give you some examples on how that works out, because we don't have to start from square one. I mean, that's really the good news. The third component of the partnership system is a low degree of built-in violence, because it's simply not needed to maintain these rigid rankings of control. But I want to say two things here. One, that doesn't mean that there's never any violence. We're not talking about a utopia, something ideal. People sometimes lose it, but it doesn't have to be built into the system. That's the big difference. And I also want to say that there are actually some hierarchies in partnership systems, because, we need parents. Every society needs parents, needs teachers, needs managers, needs leaders, but there's a big difference. And again, I had to coin words, language, make a distinction between hierarchies of domination, and we all know those, and hierarchies of actualization, in which accountability, respect, benefit doesn't just flow from the bottom up, but both ways. Also from the parent is responsible, the teacher is responsible. Do you see what I'm saying? And power, and this is so wonderful about what's happening today, because in bits and pieces, we see movement towards the partnership configuration. You've all heard the term empowering, right? Well, I mean, that term doesn't exist in the domination system, really, or the idea that what we think of as the normative ideal shouldn't be power over, but it should be power with and power to. which is a very, very, the chalice and the blade really are two symbols of power. The blade, it's the symbol of power in a domination system, the power to dominate, to control, to take life. And the chalice is a symbol of a very different kind of power, the power to give and nurture life, and yes, to illuminate life. And we haven't had the language, have we, to make these distinctions. So anyway, I want to continue here because you're such a wonderful group of people here. I want to tell you everything and I can't. So I want to go on by giving you some examples of partnership societies. Because again, they can be very different in terms of conventional categories. They can be a tribal society like the Tedurai, studied by the University of California anthropologist Stuart Schlegel. They can be agrarian societies like the Minangkabau of Sumatra, studied by the University of Pennsylvania anthropologist Peggy Sandai. They can be highly technologically developed nations like Sweden, Finland, Norway, which have moved more, not completely, not ideal. Remember, I think we have to keep remembering that the perfect is the enemy of the good. We're not looking for perfection, we're just looking for a more humane, more human, truly human way of living. And I will get back to those nations. But first, I want to add, again, the knowledge to support a new worldview is here. We have it. And it's up to us, to you, to integrate that knowledge into both the academic and the popular discourse. Because we know today that there is very, very strong evidence from archaeology, from the study of myths, from DNA studies, from linguistics, that for most of our human cultural evolution, thousands and thousands of years, yes, the direction oriented more to partnership. And I am really not only speaking now of the thousands of years, millennia, when we lived in foraging societies, and you've all heard the conventional narrative about that, right? Evolutionary imperatives that make us, violent and selfish, purely selfish. Well, the evidence is that this is not only a very destructive story, very destructive narrative, but it's a totally inaccurate narrative. I have had the pleasure to write my forthcoming book called Nurturing Our Humanity with probably the world's greatest expert on foraging societies, both contemporary and prehistoric, Douglas Fry. And that book called Nurturing Our Humanity, How Domination or Partnership Shape Our Brains, Lives, and Future, will be published next year with Oxford University Press. So, but my friends, this is a small inroad into a fortress of domination thinking. And I really have to say that we've got to change the scholarly narrative. But I'll get back to that. Because I also want to tell you, I said it isn't just the thousands of years of what Doug Fry calls the original partnership societies, the foraging societies, but it was also some of our early farming societies. For example, in the Chalice and the Blade and in Sacred Pleasure, I have quite a lot of discussion about a site that's about 8,000 years old in Turkey called Çatalhöyük. And in that site, think about it for a moment, no signs of destruction through warfare for over 1,000 years. So warfare is relatively recent, despite what we're told in the conventional narrative. No signs of huge differences between haves and have-nots in the houses or in the grave goods. And probably most shocking to many people, because of the conventional narrative about, how women and men are naturally supposed to relate or divinely ordained to relate, as Ian Hodder, who's the archaeologist now excavating Çatalhöyük, noted in his Scientific American article, Women and Men in Çatalhöyük, and I really want to read this. This was a society in which, and I'm quoting, in which sexual differences, that is gender differences, did not translate into differences in status and power. Now, we really have to get this information into the narrative that is being taught in our schools, that is being taught in our universities, that the media are discussing. Because to many people, it's shocking, right? Because it is so contrary to the canon, which still tells a very different story. But if you really think about it, and this was something fascinating when I was doing the research for the Chalice and the Blade, and I started to look at some of our most ancient myths. And so many of them from all world regions give us such clear clues to this earlier time. I'll just give you one example, the Tao Te Ching from China. And what does it tell us? That there was a time before the yin or feminine principle was subordinated to the yang or male principle. It's very clearly states that this was a much more peaceful and equitable time, and it states in which the wisdom of the mother was still honored. You know all these pictures of these bearded old men? That's how wisdom, right? How we've been taught to think of wisdom. Women are supposed to be gossips, or, well, I don't even want to go there, but think of the fairy tales. The older women are witches or evil stepmothers, right? I mean, what are we teaching our children? What have we been teaching our children? Well, it's all part of the domination narrative, isn't it? And I was very happy to hear that right here in Ireland, we're now finding traces of this earlier, more woman and peace honoring partnership orientation, not just in Celtic settlements, which did incorporate some of these earlier traditions, but in pre-Celtic ones, such as Ishnaya. And did I pronounce that correctly? Because I find the difference between the spelling and the pronunciation is dramatic. All right, so not only then do we today, because I told you we have pieces, not only do we today really know that there is very strong evidence that the original direction for many, many millennia, not just the past 5,000 or so years, was in a partnership direction, but actually, once you use the domination partnership social scale to look at modern history, what you find is that rather than being random and disconnected, all the progressive modern social movements challenged one thing: traditions of domination. I mean, think about it for a moment. The 18th century Enlightenment, so-called rights of man movement, what did it challenge? The so-called divinely ordained right of kings to rule over their subjects, right? What did the feminist movement challenge? The so-called, again, divinely ordained right of men to rule over the women and children in the, quote, castles, a military metaphor of their homes. The abolitionist, the civil rights, the anti-colonial movement, they challenged another tradition of domination, the so-called, again, divinely ordained right of a, quote, superior race to rule over, quote, inferior ones. And this is the theme. If you look, for example, at the economic equity and human rights movement, they challenge top-down rule and abuse and control. The peace movement, and yes, the movement that you are so directly engaged in, the movement to change traditions of violence against women and children, although sometimes it's against boys, you know, I mean, as we so movingly heard today, I was so moved by that story, as I know all of us are. Unfortunately, it happens. And it's really because of this sense of aggrieved entitlement that masculinity is taught to boys and men. But that's something that I'll maybe be able to touch in just a moment, because, well, I'll just say it now. Our old gender stereotypes rob both halves of humanity, women and men, of their full humanity. You know, women are robbed of our capacity for assertiveness, right? You know, we're wall breakers, I mean, witches, bitches. And men, yeah, you know, I mean, if they're soft or feminine, they're not, quote, real men. Well, so we rob men of part of their humanity, rob women of the capacity I mean, the fact that we're raising our voices now, that you are bringing these voices out here in Ireland, and that you're taking leadership, I mean, that is really very important in the movement towards the partnership world that we want to create. But to continue with the modern movements, even the environmental movement challenges the tradition of domination, our once hallowed conquest of nature, right? That at our level of technological development could lead us to an evolutionary dead end. So they're all really not random and disconnected. They're all of one piece. But, and this is a very critical thing that I'd really like you to really think about. The vast majority of these progressive social movements have focused on dismantling the top of the domination pyramid. In other words, political, economic, religious control. But they have paid scant attention to the foundations on which the pyramid rests, which, as I've said, are these foundational gender and parent-child relations that children first experience and observe, and that are very different depending on the degree to which a culture or subculture orients to either end of the partnership domination continuum. So what's happened is that domination systems keep rebuilding themselves on these foundations. Look, whether it was Nazi Germany, it's no coincidental. I mean, we have to start really connecting the dots, and of course we couldn't connect the dots because so many of the crucial dots, huge dots, were missing. But it's not coincidental that a top priority for the Nazis was getting women back into their, quote, traditional roles in a, quote, traditional family. I mean, that's code, isn't it? For a rigidly male-dominated, authoritarian family, where children observe that one kind of human is more valuable than another kind of human. And yes, a highly punitive family where they learn early on that it's very painful to question orders, no matter how brutal or unjust. So, and it's not coincidental that this was a focus, returning to the traditional family for Stalin. When he came into power, I mean, not that Lenin, I mean, they tried to sort of do something, but they didn't really enforce it. Nor is it coincidental that it's a major, major priority for fundamentalists of all stripes, Eastern or Western, which are really not religious fundamentalists, they're domination fundamentalists. Because look, they want to have top-down control, authoritarian control in both the family and the state. They want to have rigid male control over women in both families and the state or tribe. And yes, they believe in holy wars. They believe in violence. These are patterns. These are configurations. So today we have this information. We also today have something we didn't have for a long, long time, which is kind of strange. gender studies, women's studies and men's studies. And that is strange, isn't it, given that, you know, we're talking about male and female socialization, which is socialization to be human, isn't it, for each half of humanity. They're only a few decades old, and they're still marginalized in the academy, aren't they? Neuroscience, what I've been mentioning to you, are these findings about the formative relations and how important these are in affecting nothing less than how our brains develop. That's also relatively new. So what I'm trying to say to you is that women and children together are the vast majority of humanity. And it's really very strange, if you look at it objectively, that so much of what we've been taught as knowledge and truth, or as important, has simply left this out. So let's really then make the difference. And this is what I want to close with, because I want to briefly talk to you about four cornerstones that we have to build if we are to have the foundations for that better future for women, children, and men. First is childhood. We know, as I've kept repeating to you, but I will say it once more, that we know from neuroscience that what children experience and observe in family and early relations directly impacts nothing less than how our brains develop, and that these experiences are shaped by the degree to which a family, as part of the larger subculture or culture, orients to either the domination or partnership side of the continuum. Now, it's logical that if family relations, my friends, are based on chronic violations of human rights, and children are taught that this is normal, this is even moral, right? That we really can't expect the majority of those people, thank goodness, some people who grow up with this say no. And that's another finding from neuroscience I want to just very briefly mention to you. This whole notion that we are wired, right, for aggression and for pure selfishness is absolute nonsense. Because what we're discovering is that actually we humans are wired for empathy. And our species, as a matter of fact, could not survive without at least some degree of caring for our young, which takes such a long time to mature. But that's another speech. But I just wanted to mention that to you. So what we're really talking about here is that violence, when children grow up and see that violence is acceptable and is considered moral, as they're taught, you know, I'm going to punish you because you are bad, right, and I'm going to hit you, they learn that violence is acceptable in dealing with conflict or problems and to maintain and impose control. And again, they learn this not only about intimate relations, but it's a template they carry over into all relations. And they learn it not only on a mental and emotional level, but on a neural level. I mean, this is what we have to deal with now. So Ireland can and must be a model by focusing, well, first of all, on legislation, but much more than legislation. We really, and I hope that you will succeed in what you're doing here to change the worldview, to change the socialization. And that takes me to gender too, which is the second cornerstone. Again, as I said, how a society constructs the roles and relations of the two basic forms of humanity, male and female, doesn't just affect our individual life options, it affects what we consider valuable or not valuable, what we consider moral or abnormal, and it affects everything: politics, economics, religion. as the global women's movement spreads, and now also the men's movement, we're seeing more and more men taking care of babies. And we're seeing more and more women, taking positions of leadership, which is absolutely against, women were supposed to be silent, right? So how can you lead if you can't even talk? So, but it's much too slow. And I have done a lot of work really studying what I call the global pandemic of abuse and violence against women and children. And I, a few years ago, wrote a piece, it's in all my books, but I also wrote a piece for a Cambridge University Press book, which unfortunately, 5 people read these books, they cost a fortune, but really suggesting something I'd like to really throw out here, that not only under national law should those who do not enforce laws prohibiting violence against women and children, but that international law, including the Rome Statute, should be invoked, because this is a foundational global issue. And it will only happen if we make it happen, by the way. So it takes me to the third cornerstone, which of course is economic relations. And I here again want to start with this gendered system of values. Because, we now have empirical evidence that the devaluation of women and the so-called feminine directly affects a society's general quality of life. And the Center for Partnership Studies, which is the organization that I'm president of, did a study back in 1995, a pioneering study drawing from data from 89 nations, showing that the status of women is one of the best predictors we have of general quality of life. And it isn't only because women are half of the species, it's also because of the dynamics I've been trying to explain to you that, and by the way, this has now been confirmed by other studies, like the World Economics, World Value Survey and the World Economic Forum's gender gap reports. The nations with the lowest gender gaps, and I'll get back to them in just 1 second here, also regularly rank very high in the World Economic Forum's global competitiveness reports. So, gender equity is vital. And unfortunately, and this is something that's very hard for people to understand and to accept, both capitalist and socialist theory not only came out of very early industrial times, and we're now well into the post-industrial age, but they came out of much more rigid domination times. And so neither really has anything to say about caring for people or for nature. Nothing. For Adam Smith and Karl Marx, nature was there to be exploited. So, as for the work of caring for people in home, which they consider just women's work, the work they're supposed to do for free, right, in a male-controlled household, for them, that wasn't even productive. It was just reproductive work. So while we certainly want to retain whatever partnership elements there are in markets and in government regulations and policies, we really have to go beyond them. And my book, The Real Wealth of Nations, describes what I call a caring economics as the next step. And I realize that a lot of people will do a double take if you say to them, caring and economics in the same sentence. But think about it. Isn't that a terrible comment on how we've been socialized to accept that economic systems should be governed by uncaring values. And I just got a signal that I have to close soon. So I'm going to simply say to you that we have to measure economic health differently. We know today that if the value of care work were included, studies show that it would constitute 30 to 50% of the reported GDP. I mean, that's huge, isn't it? So that's something else that I'm asking you to please bring into the conversation. And nations like Sweden, Finland, and Norway, where the status of women is higher, have more democratic state and family, have more caring policies. They pioneered paid parental leave. They pioneered good care for children. They also, as far as violence goes, they pioneered the first peace studies and the first laws making it against the law to use physical discipline against children. Now, these are not coincidences. They have moved more to the partnership configuration, and a major part of this is that the status of women is higher. Women are about half of the national legislature. So men no longer find it such a threat to their status, to their quote masculinity, to also support caring policies. And these nations were so poor at the beginning of the 20th century that there were famines. Today, as I said, they have the lowest gender gaps, and they are always high in the highest ranks of the World Economic Forum's gender gap reports. But I want to close with the fourth cornerstone because it is very, very important, and that is narratives and language. You wouldn't know any of this, would you, from our conventional narratives? So obviously, as I said, these old stories are not only not adaptive, but they are inaccurate, and we have to change them. And as for language, consider what linguistic psychologists tell us, that language provides an almost unconsciously agreed on set of categories for experience and allows the speakers of that language to ignore experiences excluded by the common category system. So given our domination heritage, it should not surprise us that the only categories of our language that describe gender relations are matriarchy and patriarchy. And what do they tell us? That our only alternatives are either men or women ruling. So consider our language, the language we've inherited from more rigid domination times, has no word for egalitarian gender relations, which again is why the new language of partnership is so essential. Now, there's much more I'd like to share with you, but I want to close by saying, look, the real struggle for our future is not between East and West and North and South, or capitalism and socialism, or religion versus secularism, but within all of these sectors, between those who want to move towards the partnership side, even though they may still not use this language, and those trying to push us back and pull us back to the domination side. And you are here playing a major role in accelerating the shift to partnership, because you're focusing on two of the cornerstones, aren't you? Childhood and gender. And of course, we also have to focus, if we're going to end traditions of abuse and violence, especially against women and children, we also have to focus on the other two cornerstones, which are economics, to give value to the, quote, women's work, right, of caring and caregiving, which is so essential, especially in our post-industrial world. And yes, all four cornerstones are inextricably interconnected. Cultures are human creations, and each of you can play a part in accelerating the shift from domination to partnership. So let's all really break out of the domination trance that makes insensitivity, violence, and cruelty seem inevitable, and use our enormous human capacities for consciousness, caring, and creativity to build the missing foundations, the four cornerstones, for that more peaceful and equitable and safe partnership future we so want to need for ourselves, our children, and generations to come. I thank you.